Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we discussed strategies for crafting more effective introductions to written arguments. We learned how to balance description and explanation, or how to successfully convey a topic to our audiences, even as we show them why it matters. We also learned how to add specificity and substance to our claims. You may remember I used those words, specificity and substance, quite a bit last time. And we learned how to do this through careful use of details and by avoiding generalizations and universalizing statements. Statements like, since the beginning of time, humans have written poetry, right? That's a statement that may be true, but way too general. Finally, we practiced using the what, so what test to gauge the strength of our introductions and identify ways to make them even more powerful. In other words, you want your readers to know what your topic is and why they should care, and that is the so what part. But as I suggested at the end of our last lecture, even the strongest introduction can't save a written argument that is disjointed or lacks coherence. If you're wandering all over the place in your writing, just sort of writing your thoughts down as they come to you without any sort of plan or organizational model to guide you, you're going to lose your reader's attention pretty quickly. And of course, that's the last thing you want to have happen. By examining how arguments are structured and presented, you'll learn how to more effectively guide your readers from one point to the next, and how to avoid structural flaws and inconsistencies that may distort or obscure the main purpose or goal of your argument. You want to make sure that your reader understands what it is you're trying to say and they're not trying to work so hard to figure it out. In order to do this, we're going to spend some time with our old friend Jonathan Swift, whom we've talked about quite a bit up till this point, and his essay, A Modest Proposal. And we're also going to talk some more about Thoreau's classic essay, Civil Disobedience. And we focused on Thoreau a little more last time. Today, we're also going to spend some time with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and this will help with understanding the issue of organization of an essay. So, how do you organize a piece of writing? You might have lots of things you want to say and no clue how to get those things onto the page in some kind of coherent form. And with some kinds of writing, a chronological structure can work really well. You start at the beginning, you write through the middle, and you go on to the end. But sometimes the most important parts of a text might be in the middle. And you don't want your readers to have to hunt for the best bits. In other words, you don't want them to be buried and hard to find. So chronology is one way to organize a piece of writing. Another perfectly acceptable and workable way is to follow some version of the basic 5-paragraph model. And you can expand it if you need to do more than 5. You could use this same model in 7 or 8 paragraphs or even 10. A lot of you are probably already familiar with this model. And in this situation, the idea is that your first paragraph states your main claim. Paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, or however many you need, each offer supporting points for that main claim or idea that you stated in the first paragraph, and then the final paragraph reiterates your main point. Or if you want to boil this down even more, as one colleague of mine says, the basic form of this model is just 3 steps. Number 1, tell your reader what you're going to tell them. Number 2, tell them. Number 3, tell them what you just told them. These approaches can work well as a basic argumentative structure, but I found that the best way to guide your readers from one point to the next is really to establish what I call the key terms of your argument. And you should do this as early as possible. And then you can return to and expand on these key terms, on these main ideas throughout the piece. As one of my own instructors used to say, get them on your turf. Make them speak your language. And this approach can really work very nicely and easily with the basic 5-paragraph or a chronological approach. But using key terms adds a layer of sophistication to your argument that might otherwise be lacking. Once the key terms and ideas of your argument are in place, so in other words, once you've got the audience on your turf, then the process of organization becomes a matter of consistently referring back to, linking, and developing those terms and ideas. In other words, as you write, you are helping the audience learn to speak your language. And right about now, you're probably wondering, okay, what does she mean by key terms? She's said it at least 7 times up to this point. Let's look at some classic examples to get an idea of what this means. And I think this is the easiest way to understand what I mean when I say key terms or key ideas. So first, let's go back to Swift, and let's look at how Swift establishes the terms of his argument in A Modest Proposal. And by now, you probably can recall quite easily that this essay is a satirical argument about how the Irish should adopt a policy of eating their own children as a way to end poverty and hunger. You might remember that we've discussed this one passage in a few lectures, but just in case you're not thinking of it right now or the details have escaped you, here is the passage that I really want you to pay attention to today. It begins, quote, "I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will serve equally in a fricassee or a ragout." Now, obviously, one of Swift's greatest challenges, and again, we're approaching this with tongue firmly planted in cheek, is to convince his audience to put aside the notion of children as children and replace that notion with children as food. And they're not just any old grub, but rather quite tasty food that can be served, Swift assures us, at least 4 different ways: stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And maybe 6 different ways if you're venturesome enough to try a fricassee or a ragout. To press this new association even further, Swift wants his audience to know a little bit more. So he continues on. And he says, "A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends. And when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper or salt, will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter." The lesson we can take from Swift is that there are innumerable ways to define a word and the concepts associated with it, even a word as seemingly straightforward as child. In fact, the very absurdity of Swift's attempts to redefine a child as a food source is evidence of how good writers can, and I would argue must, convince audiences to see the topic on their terms. Unlinking a word from one set of meanings and associating it with an entirely different set of ideas can be an extremely effective way to catch and hold your reader's attention. And it can also be a way that you convince them to see the world in a different light. So Swift's key term or idea here is child or children, but the language he uses to discuss children, all of these terms are drawn from the world of cuisine and cooking. All right, so his key terms, the world of cooking, and child is detached from what we might think of as its typical key terms. Now, once you've committed yourself to redefining a word or concept, you have to follow through by reiterating and developing the new connections you want your audience to make. That is to say, once you've introduced them to your language, you'll have to keep speaking it and expanding the vocabulary. Swift is an expert at using this strategy to organize his argument. And he continues on, and he says, quote, "I have already computed the charge of nursing a beggar's child to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included, and I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good fat child, which, as I have said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat. Those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen." So Swift continues to affirm the child as food connection, but now he adds an extra twist. Those of you who are familiar with the essay no doubt recognize the move that he's making. For the rest of you, Think for a moment, what new set of terms and ideas is Swift bringing into the mix? What new language does he seem to be using? That's right. After establishing this new definition of the child as food, Swift takes what is now an entirely logical next step, one could argue, by addressing the issue of economics and commodification. And he does this by running his own cost-benefit analysis of the child as livestock. His argument is quite compelling. What could be better than a food source that is not just tasty and nutritional, but a good buy as well? What businessman worth his salt, could pass up such a bargain? Swift then rounds out the new set of association by pressing the notion of child as food as commodity to the final logical step, which I read to you at the end there, where he notes that those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which artificially dressed will make admirable gloves for ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. So let's pause for a moment to recap the organizational pattern Swift has established for us. First, we're introduced to the radical idea of children as potential food source. Next, we're led to consider them in more detail as a culinary dish, or rather a series of dishes that would be welcome at the family dining table. Next, we're made to understand the value of this new food source in both nutritional and economic terms. And finally, we're prompted to consider the idea that children, having served their purpose at the dinner table, could also provide some rather useful material for gloves and boots, and that having fed us, they could clothe us, or at least accessorize us too. By this point, we're so far onto Swift's turf and so deeply immersed in his language, terms, and meanings that we can't help but follow along. And like Swift, we may not venture so far as to flay the carcass for gloves and boots, but that's only because we've already accepted his notion of child as food and made it our normative definition as well. Or at least, for the purposes of getting through this essay, we've completely suspended our disbelief. We've put what would be our natural reaction, which I'm guessing here would be horror. We've put that natural reaction off to the side. If we're going to be able to keep reading, we would have to do that out of necessity. In order to keep going and follow his logic, we have to recognize that this is a deliberate exercise in absurdity. But we keep going because in or through this satire, an important point is being made. Now, once again, I would urge you to pay close attention not just to the pattern of organization that Swift lays out for us, but to the underlying principle of redefinition and redevelopment of familiar terms and concepts that makes this pattern possible. He pushes us along, treating children like animals, and then we move to food sources, to commodities to be bought and sold. We follow him from one point to the next because he guides us with careful organization. So clearly, organizing an argument requires you to establish some sense of continuity as you move from one point to the next. That's a basic premise of any writing guide. Swift demonstrates both the continuity and progression between points. But establishing that continuity involves a whole lot more than just making sure you have effective transitions between paragraphs and points. Rather, you really need to approach the organizing process as though you are trying to teach your readers a new language with its own particular vocabulary and grammar. And this is a vocabulary and grammar for which you've set and developed the terms. Now, I don't at all mean to suggest that you ignore standard advice about organizing arguments. Identify your main point and then marshal or arrange your other subordinate points in support of that main point. But I do hope that you can see that this sort of advice I'm giving you about key terms sort of floats over a deeper set of strategies that require us first to control the language that we use to present our ideas, and then to build on and expand that language as our argument unfolds. Let's take a moment to try out this strategy in our own writing. Start by choosing a word that most people would easily recognize and connect to a conventional set of meanings. Say, for example, government. Probably pretty much everyone has a general idea of what government is and a general sense of what it does. Try drafting 3 or 4 paragraphs in which you take control of the term government and define it for yourself. If you can right now, you can stop the tape and do this, or if you're driving in the car, don't have the means by which you could stop the tape and draft a few paragraphs, all you have to do is sort of think, okay, if I had to write 3 paragraphs on government, what are some of the terms I would use in each of those paragraphs? So just take a moment and try and come up with some key terms. You would start by associating it with the idea or meaning you think is most important, and then build on and develop that meaning in subsequent paragraphs. What you want to do is try to reiterate and expand on your initial definition, and then use that process, reiteration and expansion, to organize your writing. Again, if you're not in a place or a space where you can easily stop the recording and do this, that's just fine. Just take a couple seconds to think of ideas you associate with government and how they might progress from one to another. We're going to revisit this exercise at the end of the lecture, and you can get some sense then, I think, of what I'm looking for. For those of you who right now have the chance to try this exercise, I'll ask you to revise those paragraphs and make them even stronger a little bit later on. Let's take a look at how Thoreau establishes the terms of his argument in the second paragraph of Civil Disobedience. This is a paragraph that will serve as kind of a, what we might say, microcosmic guide for the organization of the essay as a whole. And Thoreau says, "This American government, what is it but a tradition, though a recent one? Endeavoring to transmit itself unimpaired to posterity, but each instant losing some of its integrity. It has not the vitality and force of a single living man, for a single man can bend it to his will. It is a sort of wooden gun to the people themselves." Now, while their styles are different, Thoreau and Swift do share a common investment in redefining commonly held ideas about their topics, and both of them are seeking to establish their own set of terms that they can then use to present their arguments and to present those arguments more effectively and compellingly. Thoreau's goal is to acknowledge government as a necessary tool for satisfying a public need. But he also wants to argue that through constant misuse and application, this tool has become more apt to control citizens than to be controlled by them. So here, that's one more time. Think of that. He's arguing the tool of government is more likely to control citizens than the citizens are likely to control the government. Right? So that's the important distinction he's making. He goes on in a later passage to say, "The people must have some complicated machinery or other, and hear its din to satisfy that idea of government which they have. Governments show thus how successfully men can be imposed on, even impose on themselves for their own advantage. It is excellent, we must allow." Thoreau then proceeds to refashion the notion that government does things for people and replaces it with the idea that people themselves are the key source of agency. He's saying that government has actually limited the potential of Americans to achieve liberty, property, and education. In a paragraph full of emphasis, and the emphasis that you'll hear me use here is in the original, Thoreau goes on to say, "Yet this government never of itself furthered any enterprise, but by the alacrity with which it got out of its way. It does not keep the country free. It does not settle the West. It does not educate. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if the government had not sometimes got in its way." As readers familiar with Civil Disobedience will recognize, Thoreau uses the key ideas in the selections we've looked at as the organizational structure for the entire essay. he returns to and elaborates on them in subsequent paragraphs, always building on them and never moving off to another idea or term that isn't somehow connected to what we find in these initial paragraphs. Again, if you want to create your new own terms and ideas, your own key set of main points, you want to make sure that you don't give your audience too many so that they get lost and they can't follow you. So Thoreau is a great example of how he limits himself and all his key terms flow naturally from his main idea about government. Now again, Thoreau is not exactly Swiftian in style. He uses satire in other pieces, but never to the extent that Swift does when he proposes that the Irish should eat their babies. At the same time, the underlying approaches to organization on the part of these two authors are very much the same in that each one recognizes the power of getting an audience on his turf and compelling them to accept new perceptions of what seem to be familiar ideas. Now let's take a look at another example. And this one comes from Thomas Paine's famous essay pamphlet, Common Sense. And in that essay, Paine says, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. For when we suffer or are exposed to the same miseries by a government, which we might expect in a country without a government, our calamity is heightened, reflecting that we furnish the means by which we suffer." What key terms and ideas does Paine define for himself? Well, it shouldn't be too difficult to see in this case that he wants to both redefine and reclaim two notions, society and government. And he feels that people have mistakenly and unfortunately confused these two notions with each other. Society and government are not the same thing. He's not going so far, at least not yet, as to offer entirely new definitions of these terms. At this point, his goal is to realign two sets of meanings that he thinks have been incorrectly assigned. Like Thoreau, he also wants to underscore the extent to which government has limited and restricted the potential of people rather than supported or enhanced it. As those of you who've studied Common Sense already know, Paine uses this paragraph as the organizational basis for the whole rest of the essay, and he consistently refers back to and expands on the terms and ideas that he introduces here. In addition to establishing and defining the key terms and ideas of an argument, the process of organization should involve really careful attention to transitions. If the links from one point to the next aren't there, or if they aren't strong enough, then the argument won't be as effective as it could be. The easiest and most successful strategy for crafting transitions is what I call the repetition variation approach. Again, one more time, the repetition variation approach. And by repetition variation, I mean taking a word or phrase from the end of one paragraph or section of an argument and using it, preferably with a small change or a slight variation, as the beginning of the next paragraph or section. So to illustrate this strategy, let's look at Paine's Common Sense one more time. Here's the end of one paragraph in the piece. And Paine writes, "However prejudice may warp our wills or interest darken our understanding, the simple voice of nature and of reason will say, 'It is right.'" Okay, so notice that Paine uses the words nature and simple, and he's going to build on those words and their associations as he transitions into the next paragraph. So be listening for the words nature and simple as he goes on. "I draw my idea of the form of government from a principle in nature, which no art can overturn, that the more simple anything is, the less liable it is to be disordered, and the easier repaired when disordered." Okay, there's nothing especially complicated or difficult about this transition strategy, but I'm always surprised by how often my students either completely ignore or underuse it in their writing, because it's really a way that they can form connections quite easily from one point to the next and one paragraph to the next. Another form of transition, somewhat less elegant but certainly effective when used carefully and judiciously, is the sequence or series. And sometimes I call this first, next, then, or first, secondly, thirdly. But sequence series works just as well as a sort of catch-all phrase to hold that idea in your mind. You probably have tried this yourself. And it's a really useful means of organizing information, but you have to be really careful about boring your readers with too many lists. In Paine's examination of the English Constitution, he goes ahead and he lists the following issues, and he does it this way. First, the remains of monarchical tyranny in the person of the king. Secondly, the remains of aristocratical tyranny in the persons of the peers. Thirdly, the new republican materials in which the persons of the commons on whose virtue depends the freedom of England. And as you can see from this example, a sequence or a series can be a really dynamic form of transition. Not only has Paine managed to convey a lot of information clearly and succinctly, but he's also set his reader up to move from one point to the next. But, and I bet a lot of you out there are anticipating what I'm about to say here, this device, like all devices, has to be used with restraint. If you do too many sequences, you might as well be writing a grocery list. Because by the time you get to the 20th element in your list, your reader's eyes will have glazed over, and they're not going to remember what points 1 or 5 or 7 were. 5 points or elements in a series is really about the limit of what your average reader's mind can keep track of. 3 points is much easier, and that's really my limit. 3 points in a list. So first, next, then, firstly, secondly, thirdly. 3 points. That's manageable. As I mentioned earlier, a sequence or series can be an effective form of transition if it's used carefully and judiciously. Not only should you limit the number of elements or ideas in a sequence or series, but you should limit the number of times you use this device. In practical terms, I'd recommend no more than one sequential or series-based transition in a written argument of less than 10 pages. In a longer piece, say if you're writing something that's 10 to 20 pages, you could effectively make use of 2 or perhaps 3 sequence series transitions, but you really don't want to do more than that, because pretty soon your reader's going to be bored. They're going to say, aha, he's doing the same thing again, sequence series, and you don't want them to stop paying attention to what you're writing because they're distracted by the stylistic moves you're making over and over again. All right, so what do we take away from this lecture? Well, I hope you'll continue to keep in mind and that you'll practice the strategy of identifying and defining for yourself the key terms of your argument. Other more basic forms of organization can work with this approach, but organizing your writing in terms of a few key ideas which you define can greatly enhance basic structural strategies like the chronological model or the 5-paragraph model. And now, obviously, you certainly don't need to follow Swift's radical example when it comes to expressing the content of your argument. You don't have to try and redefine children as food. That's already been done. But you should certainly follow the basic model he offers for organizing the points of his argument. Begin with your own definition of a keyword or idea, and then expand and build on its meanings in ways that invite or, in fact, compel your readers to accept your terms and language. I also hope you'll pay attention to the mechanics of transitions, the practical strategies for moving from one paragraph or point to another that we saw in Paine's work. Repetition, variation, and sequence series are time-tested and effective ways of topping off and complementing the organizational foundation you've established by taking control of the language and terms of your argument. And in the exercises for today's lecture, I'm going to ask you to practice the repetition, variation, and sequence series strategies in a paragraph or two about government, and by looking back at, say, a recent email you've written in which you tried to persuade someone of something. So by this point, you've learned how to begin an argument and you've acquired some strategies for organizing your writing. But even the most engaging opening and the cleverest structure will be completely useless if you don't adequately support your argument. If you don't really try to tell your reader as clearly as possible, so what? In our next lecture, we'll look at strategies for supporting your claims and making your argument as persuasive as possible.